Morgan, a Navy veteran, came to the Louisiana Bayou to bury his past. He only wanted peace, but his dog, Ranger, had other plans. After a storm, he leads him to a tangled orange life vest, looking as normal as any other piece of driftwood. But Morgan, with the experience of a soldier, saw what others would miss. One of the straps wasn't torn, wasn't frayed, but had been cut cleanly, deliberately. It wasn't trash, it was a message. And when the local deputy showed up with a chilling warning, instead of an investigation, Morgan knew he had accidentally found the key to a deadly secret the entire town was trying to sink. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The sound of the engine dying was the loudest thing Morgan had heard in an hour. He switched off the ignition of his old pickup truck, and the silence that rushed in was thick, heavy, and alive. It wasn't the absence of noise, it was a wall of sound built from a million tiny things. The drone of cicadas, the low hum of mosquitoes, the distant croak of a bullfrog, and the soft, wet sigh of the bayou itself. He sat for a long moment, his hands still resting on the steering wheel, letting the oppressive Louisiana humidity seep through the open windows. It felt like breathing water. Morgan was a tall man in his late 30s, with a frame that was lean but strong, honed by years of military discipline. His short brown hair was beginning to show threads of silver at the temples, a stark contrast to the youthful weariness in his blue eyes. A neatly trimmed but slightly thick beard and mustache covered a rugged, weathered face that seemed caught between harshness and an innate kindness. He wore what had become his uniform in civilian life, a faded blue and gray plaid shirt, unbuttoned over a plain gray t-shirt, worn denim jeans, and sturdy work boots. Every movement he made was economical, deliberate, a habit forged in places where wasted motion could have dire consequences. Beside him in the passenger seat, a large head lifted from the worn upholstery. A pair of intelligent amber eyes blinked slowly, then fixed on Morgan's face. Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd, was a magnificent animal. His coat was a distinctive mix of gray and white, a rare coloring that made him look like a creature born from mist and moonlight. A predominantly gray saddle ran down his back, while brilliant white fur covered his chest, underbelly, and legs. He was large for his breed, with a deep chest and a powerful athletic build that spoke of controlled strength. Ranger's temperament was as steady as his gaze. He was a calm, observant dog, deeply attuned to the man beside him. He wasn't just a pet, he was a partner, a guardian, and in the quiet, desperate hours of the night, an anchor. "Well, boy," Morgan said, his voice a low rumble. "This is it. Pelican's Rest." Ranger let out a soft whine, not of anxiety, but of acknowledgement. He shifted his weight, his nose twitching as he sampled the 1,000 new scents carried on the damp air. Morgan opened his door and swung his legs out, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, dark earth. He looked at their new home. It was a house on stilts, a classic bayou design, built to survive the river's changing moods. The wooden siding was weathered to a silvery gray, and a wide, screened-in porch wrapped around the front, offering a vantage point over the dark, tannin-stained water that lapped at the pilings below. It was isolated, remote, and Morgan hoped, peaceful. He had bought it online, sight unseen, drawn by the promise of solitude that the satellite images seemed to offer. He needed a place where the world's noise couldn't reach him. They spent the rest of the afternoon in a rhythmic, quiet routine of unpacking. Morgan carried boxes up the wooden stairs, the structure groaning under his weight. Ranger conducted a thorough patrol of the property line, his tail held low and steady, his gait purposeful. He investigated the cypress trees draped in Spanish moss and the thick palmetto bushes, his occasional snorts the only commentary on his findings. Inside, the house was simple: 2 small bedrooms, a basic kitchen, and a living area with large windows that looked out onto the endless green and brown of the swamp. It smelled of damp wood, dust, and disuse. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Morgan stood on the porch, a bottle of water in his hand. The day's heat finally began to break, but the air remained thick. The sounds of the bayou changed as the creatures of the night began to stir. The chorus of frogs grew louder, and the chirps of crickets joined in. It was a world away from the steel gray decks of a Navy vessel, a world away from the arid, dusty landscapes that haunted his memory. This was supposed to be a place to heal. But as darkness settled, Morgan felt the familiar tension coiling in his gut. The quiet here was different. It wasn't empty. It was full of secrets. Ranger seemed to sense the shift in his mood and came to sit beside him, resting his heavy head on Morgan's knee. Morgan absently stroked the dog's soft ears, the repetitive motion a small comfort against the rising tide of his own thoughts. Later that night, sleep did not come easy. When it finally did, it was a dark, treacherous sea that dragged him back to a place he was desperate to forget. He was on the water, but it wasn't the slow, dark bayou. It was the choppy gray ocean under a moonless sky. The smell of diesel fuel and salt was sharp in his nostrils. There were shouts, the metallic clang of an alarm, and the desperate, panicked voice of a young sailor, a kid named Miller, calling his name. Morgan was running, his boots skidding on the wet deck, but it felt like moving through mud. He saw the face of his commanding officer, impassive and cold, turning away. It was a tragic accident, the officer's voice echoed, disembodied and final. We have our orders. The report is filed. We move on. But Morgan knew it wasn't an accident. He knew something had been covered up, a truth deliberately sunk to the bottom of the sea along with a young man's life. He opened his mouth to scream, to protest, but no sound came out. He was trapped in silence, choking on the injustice. Morgan awoke with a violent gasp, his body drenched in sweat. He was tangled in his thin bedsheet, his heart hammering against his ribs as if trying to break free. The dark, unfamiliar room pressed in on him, the shadows of the cypress trees outside his window like skeletal fingers. For a terrifying moment, he didn't know where he was. The nightmare clung to him, its oily residue making it hard to breathe. Then he felt a solid, heavy weight press against his chest. A wet nose nudged his hand. Ranger was standing beside the bed, his front paws planted firmly on the mattress, his head lowered to Morgan's level. The dog let out a low, guttural whine, a sound of deep concern. He licked the sweat from Morgan's brow, a rough, grounding touch. Morgan's frantic breathing began to slow. He wrapped an arm around the dog's powerful neck, burying his face in Ranger's thick fur. The dog didn't move, simply stood like a living statue, a warm, solid anchor in the swirling chaos of Morgan's mind. He was real. This room was real. The past was just a ghost. "It's okay, boy," Morgan whispered, his voice hoarse. "I'm here. I'm okay." He untangled himself from the sheets and swung his legs over the side of the bed, sitting in the darkness for a long time, with Ranger's head resting faithfully in his lap. The bond between them went deeper than owner and pet. In the darkest hours, Ranger was his therapist, his guardian, the one living thing that could pull him back from the edge. Finally, he stood and walked onto the screened-in porch, Ranger padding silently behind him. The air had changed. A cool wind was picking up, rattling the Spanish moss in the trees. The humidity had intensified, a heavy electric feeling that charged the atmosphere. In the far distance, a flicker of lightning silently illuminated the clouds, followed moments later by a low, deep rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Stilt house. The chorus of frogs and insects had fallen silent, the bayou holding its breath in anticipation. A storm was coming. A big one. It was churning in the distance, a dark and violent force, gathering its strength before making its way up the river. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and eerily silent. When Morgan stepped onto the porch, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand, the air was cool and crisp, scrubbed free of the oppressive humidity from the day before. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The bayou, however, was a different entity entirely. The dark, placid water had risen several inches up the pilings of the house, and was now a churning, muddy brown, its surface cluttered with a thick carpet of debris. Entire branches, clusters of leaves, and unidentifiable bits of swamp life had been torn loose and were now caught in the slow, powerful current. Ranger stood beside him, his posture alert, his nose working overtime to decipher the new tapestry of scents the storm had delivered. The chaotic energy of the night had been replaced by a tense, watchful calm. For Morgan, the cleanup was a welcome distraction. It was a mission, a tangible problem with a clear solution, a far cry from the shadowy, formless enemies that plagued his sleep. His plan for the day was simple: take the small aluminum skiff that came with the property and survey the perimeter, making sure no major trees had fallen on his land and clearing any blockages near his small dock. An hour later, the outboard motor of the skiff sputtered to life with a noisy cough. Ranger, already seated at the bow like a seasoned first mate, perked his ears up, his body thrumming with anticipation. Morgan expertly guided the small boat away from the dock and into the main channel. The water was sluggish, the boat pushing through floating islands of leaves and twigs. He navigated with a practiced ease, his years in the Navy making him as comfortable on the water as he was on land. They spent the first part of the morning circling the property. Everything seemed to be in order. As they rounded a bend in the river, Morgan was about to turn back when Ranger's demeanor suddenly changed. The dog, who had been calmly observing the scenery, now stood rigid at the bow. A low whine escaped his throat, and his head was fixed on a dense thicket of mangrove trees to their right, a spot where the storm's debris had collected into a tangled, muddy dam. He paced the small space at the front of the boat, his agitation growing, looking back at Morgan with an urgent insistence. "What is it, boy?" Morgan asked, cutting the throttle. "You see a gator?" But Ranger's focus wasn't the kind of alert curiosity he showed for wildlife. This was different. It was an intense, focused energy, the same he used when he was on a mission. Trusting the dog's instincts, a trust that had been forged in far more dangerous places than this, Morgan picked up a long paddle and began pushing the skiff toward the mangroves. The air was thick with the smell of decay and wet earth. The boat scraped against submerged branches as he forced it deeper into the thicket. And then he saw it, a flash of synthetic orange, nearly swallowed by the muddy green and brown of the swamp. It was a life vest, hopelessly tangled in the mangrove's gnarled roots. "Just some trash, boy," Morgan said, though Ranger's whining continued. With a heavy sigh, he leaned over, grabbed a corner of the vest, and began the arduous process of pulling it free. It was stuck fast, held tight by the roots and the suction of the mud. He gave one final hard tug, and it came loose with a wet, sucking sound, spattering his shirt with mud. He tossed it onto the floor of the skiff, a forgotten piece of junk. But as he turned to paddle away, his eyes caught on one of the straps. He paused. Something was wrong. He picked the vest up again, his fingers tracing the edge of the severed strap. His entire demeanor shifted. The casual homesteader was gone, replaced by the sharp, analytical mind of a sailor. In an accident, a strap like this would be frayed, torn, or stretched to its breaking point. This edge was clean. Too clean. It was a straight, deliberate line, the kind a sharp blade would make. His blood ran cold. This wasn't debris from a storm. This was evidence. He brought the skiff back to the dock, his mind racing. The illusion of peaceful solitude he had so desperately sought had been shattered. He laid the vest out on the weathered planks of his porch, the bright orange a jarring splash of color against the muted tones of the bayou. He ran his thumb over the clean cut again and again. It was a professional cut. Quick. Efficient. The low growl started deep in Ranger's chest before Morgan even heard the approaching motor. He looked up to see a police boat, its official decals stark against the wild backdrop, slowing as it neared his dock. A uniformed man stood at the helm, cutting the engine and letting the boat drift the last few feet. Ranger moved to stand directly in front of Morgan, his body tense, the fur along his spine slightly raised. The man who stepped onto the dock was a deputy sheriff, his name, Boudreau, stitched above his pocket. He was a large man, soft around the middle, his khaki uniform straining slightly at the seams. His face was flushed from the sun, and his movements were slow and deliberate, as if the humidity had settled deep in his bones. He carried himself with the easy authority of someone who had never had his power questioned. "Afternoon," Boudreaux said, his voice a lazy drawl. "Just making the rounds after the blow. Make sure everyone's all right. You must be the new fella." "Morgan," Morgan replied, his tone neutral. He did not offer his hand. Boudreaux's eyes scanned the property before landing on the life vest on the porch. He gestured toward it with his chin. "Storm churns up all kinds of trash, don't it? Find that out here?" "Something like that," Morgan said carefully. "Found it tangled up in the mangroves downriver. Strap's been cut." Boudreaux ambled up the stairs onto the porch, giving Ranger a wide berth. The dog's growl was now a low, constant rumble, a clear warning. "Easy there, dog," the deputy said without looking at him. He nudged the vest with the toe of his boot. "Cut? Probably just some fisherman using it for a buoy marker or something. Nothing to worry about." The dismissal was so quick, so absolute, that it was more suspicious than any denial. Morgan felt a chill despite the heat. "A man from New Orleans went missing in a boating accident a few weeks back," Morgan stated, watching the deputy's face for a reaction. Boudreaux's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "That was a tragedy, a real shame. Man didn't know the river. City folks come down here, they don't respect the water don't respect them back. Simple as that." He turned to leave, then paused at the top of the stairs. "A word of advice, Morgan. This here's a quiet place. Folks like it that way. Best not to go poking your nose into things that don't concern you. Bayou has a way of swallowing up folks who ask too many questions." The veiled threat hung in the thick, humid air between them. It was delivered with the casual tone of friendly advice, which only made it more menacing. Boudreaux tipped his hat, stepped back onto his boat, and started the engine. As the police boat disappeared around the bend, leaving only a churning wake behind, the silence it left felt heavier than before. Morgan stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the spot where the boat had vanished. Ranger's growl finally subsided, but the dog remained pressed against his leg, a solid, reassuring weight. He looked down at the cut life vest, then back at the dark, secretive water. The nightmare from the night before flooded back into his mind, the feeling of a truth being deliberately sunk, of injustice being swept under the rug. He had come here to escape his past, but it seemed the past had found him in a new form. He looked down at his loyal dog, whose instincts had confirmed what his own gut was telling him. This wasn't over. It had just begun. The morning after Deputy Boudreaux's visit, the bayou seemed to hold its breath. A thick, white mist clung to the surface of the water, muffling all sound and turning the familiar shapes of the cypress trees into gray, ghostly apparitions. Morgan stood on his porch, the cut life vest lying on a wooden bench beside him like an indictment. Boudreaux's words, coated in a syrupy drawl but sharp as a blade, echoed in his mind. Bayou has a way of swallowing up folks who ask too many questions. It was a clear warning, a command to stand down. But the image that truly burned in his mind was from his nightmare. The cold, dismissive face of his superior officer, the feeling of a truth being buried at sea. He looked at the severed strap on the vest. It was the same lie, just in a different place. Leaving it alone wasn't an option. It felt like a betrayal of the man who had worn it, and a betrayal of the memory of the young sailor he had failed to save. He needed information, and he wouldn't find it sitting here, isolated and watched. He needed to go to the heart of the community, however small and closed off it might be. With a new resolve, he loaded Ranger into the skiff. The dog, sensing the shift in Morgan's purpose from aimless exploration to a clear mission, was alert and focused. Morgan steered the boat downriver, following the main channel. After about 20 minutes, the wilderness began to give way to signs of civilization. A few more stilt houses appeared, then a long shared boardwalk that connected a handful of buildings, a weathered general store, a bait and tackle shop with faded signs, and a small building with a hand-painted sign that read, Annette's Cajun Kitchen. This was the town of Pelican's Rest. As Morgan tied his skiff to a post, he drew immediate attention. A couple of men in fishing waders paused their conversation to watch him, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store stopped her work, her gaze lingering on the large German shepherd who sat calmly in the boat. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, and a new face was an event, an intrusion. Morgan walked into the diner, the screen door slamming shut behind him with a loud clap. The air inside was thick with the smell of strong chicory coffee, frying bacon, and catfish. The handful of patrons, all men, stopped talking and turned to look at him. Morgan gave a slight nod, his expression unreadable, and took a seat at a small table in the corner, a spot that gave him a clear view of the room. A middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a kind face, presumably Annette, came over and he ordered a black coffee. As he nursed the hot, bitter liquid, his eyes scanned the room. In a booth by the window, a man sat alone, nursing his own coffee and looking out at the water. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a face that looked like it had been carved from old cypress wood. His skin was a deep, leathery brown, etched with a web of fine lines from a lifetime spent under the Louisiana sun. His hands, wrapped around his mug, were gnarled and powerful, the knuckles swollen, the palms calloused from decades of hauling nets and wrestling with the river. He had a shock of thick, steel-gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He wore a simple flannel shirt and work pants, but he carried himself with a quiet dignity. This, Morgan thought, was a man who knew the Bayou. After finishing his coffee, Morgan walked over to the man's booth. "Excuse me," he said. "Mind if I sit?" The old man looked up, his gaze appraising. After a moment, he grunted and gestured to the seat opposite him. "Free country." Morgan sat down. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't ask the man his name. He decided on a direct but oblique approach. "I'm new here," he began, his voice low. "Still learning the river. I was out on my skiff this morning, clearing some storm debris downriver, and I found something odd." The man sipped his coffee, his expression unchanging. "River's full of odd things." "This was a life vest," Morgan continued, watching the man's eyes carefully. "Looked pretty new, but one of the main straps, it was cut clean through, like with a knife." For the first time, the old man's impassive mask slipped. His eyes, which had been distant, now snapped into sharp focus. He put his mug down with a soft click. "Orange?" he asked, his voice a gravelly rasp. "Bright orange," Morgan confirmed. The tension in the booth was suddenly palpable. The man stared at Morgan for a long, silent moment. "My name is Andrew," he said finally. "And the man who wore that vest was a friend of mine. His name was Sterling. They said he hit a submerged log, that he was a fool who didn't know the river. It was a lie. Richard Sterling could navigate this bayou blindfolded in a hurricane." Andrew's voice was filled with a low, burning anger. "I knew something was wrong, but in a place like this, what a man knows and what he can prove are two different rivers entirely." The unspoken truth hung between them. They were no longer strangers. They were two men who shared the same dangerous suspicion. Andrew's eyes darted around the now quiet diner. "This is no place to talk," he said, his voice dropping even lower. He slid out of the booth. "You like gumbo? My place. Sundown. I'll make you a gumbo that'll make you forget your own name." He gave Morgan simple directions to his house, a mile further downriver, then turned and left without another word. That evening, Morgan guided his skiff to Andrew's dock. The house was much like his own, but it felt like a home. Wind chimes made of old shells tinkled softly on the porch, and pots of herbs grew in a makeshift window box. Andrew greeted him at the door and led him into a warm, cluttered kitchen that smelled of sausage, shrimp, and spices. A large pot of dark, rich gumbo simmered on the stove. They ate in a comfortable silence at first, the only sounds the clinking of spoons against their bowls and the chirping of crickets outside. The gumbo was the best Morgan had ever tasted. As they finished, Andrew got up and took a framed photograph from a shelf. He wiped the glass with his thumb and handed it to Morgan. It was a picture of him with a smiling, vibrant woman. "My Marie," Andrew said softly. "Been gone 10 years now, ovarian cancer. Fought like a tiger, but the fight was rigged from the start." He looked out the window at the dark water. "This place gets quiet when you're alone. Sometimes the quiet is the loudest thing there is." The raw honesty in the old man's voice struck a chord deep within Morgan. He found himself opening a door he usually kept bolted shut. "In the Navy," Morgan began, his voice hesitant, "I had a kid on my team, Miller, barely 20 years old. There was an equipment malfunction during a deep-water exercise. It wasn't an accident. It was negligence, a cover-up to protect a budget, a career." He stared down at his hands. "I was ordered to sign a report that was a lie. I followed the order. Miller's parents never knew the truth. That quiet, I know that quiet, Andrew." Andrew listened, his gaze unwavering. He didn't offer empty platitudes or words of comfort. He simply nodded, a gesture of profound and complete understanding. In that moment, the space between them filled with a shared grief, a recognition of the lonely burdens they both carried. They were two different men from two different worlds, a grizzled Cajun fisherman and a haunted Navy veteran, but they were bound by the same invisible thread, the weight of a truth that had been unjustly buried. Their alliance was no longer just a matter of convenience or shared suspicion. It had been forged into something stronger, something more akin to kinship. "Sterling was a good man," Andrew said, his voice firm with renewed purpose. "He deserves justice. And you, son, you deserve some peace." He looked at Morgan, his eyes clear and resolved. "I know this Bayou. I know its people, its secrets, its dark corners. You want to pull on that thread you found? I'll help you pull." As Morgan left Andrew's house later that night, the Bayou no longer felt as menacing. The mist had cleared, and a canopy of brilliant stars glittered overhead. For the first time since he had arrived, he didn't feel completely alone. He had found an ally. More than that, he had found a friend. The next morning, the Bayou awoke with a renewed sense of purpose. The sun climbed high, quickly burning off the morning mist, and the air was alive with the buzzing of insects and the calls of unseen birds. Morgan stood on his porch, feeling a different kind of quiet within himself. The shared conversation with Andrew had done more than just forge an alliance. It had lightened a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying alone. For the first time in years, the injustice he had witnessed felt less like a solitary prison and more like a call to action. Andrew arrived shortly after breakfast, his small, sturdy, flat-bottomed boat, stained with years of bayou water and a lifetime of hard work, pulling up to Morgan's dock. Ranger greeted the old man with a soft whine and a gentle wag of his tail, rubbing his head against Andrew's leg. The connection between the three was already palpable, a silent understanding passing between them. "I got the charts," Andrew said, holding up a rolled-up, yellowed map of the waterways. Sterling was meticulous. He marked everything. Said you never know when you'll need to find something again. Or avoid it. His eyes, sharp and clear, met Morgan's. He also told me if he ever went missing, I was to look where the old cypress stump meets the North Channel. Said that was his lucky spot. Always brought him fish there. Morgan nodded, his mind already piecing together the possibilities. A lucky spot, or a last known location. They set out, Morgan navigating Andrew's boat. The old man handled the tiller, his movements as natural as the ebb and flow of the tide. Ranger sat at the bow, his senses heightened, his powerful nose constantly sampling the complex tapestry of scents the bayou offered. The journey took them deeper into the labyrinthine waterways, through narrow channels overhung with Spanish moss, past ancient cypress trees whose gnarled roots dipped into the dark water like the claws of some forgotten swamp creature. The deeper they went, the more isolated they became. The sounds of distant motors faded, replaced by the primeval symphony of the swamp. After nearly an hour, Andrew pointed to a massive, rotting cypress stump, its top hollowed out like a broken tooth, standing sentinel at a fork in the river. "This is it," he said, his voice quiet. "The North Channel. Sterling's spot." Morgan cut the engine, and the boat drifted silently. The water here was wider, deeper, reflecting the clear blue sky above. It looked utterly peaceful, pristine. But both men knew that under such calm surfaces, the bayou held its darkest secrets. Andrew pulled out his fish finder, a small worn device that hummed softly. He began to slowly sweep the transducer through the water. The screen showed vague shapes, contours of the riverbed, but nothing definitive. "Too much debris down here," Andrew mumbled, frustrated. "Old logs, branches. This thing can't tell the difference." He sighed, running a hand over his gray hair. "It's a big stretch of water, Morgan. Even with Sterling's luck, finding a needle in a haystack would be easier." Morgan looked at the expanse of water, then down at Ranger, who sat intently beside him. The dog was scanning the surface, his ears twitching, but showed no obvious signs of agitation. He was searching, but for what? Morgan leaned over, putting a hand on Ranger's head. "Can you find it, boy? Can you find the boat?" As if understanding, Ranger lifted his head. His nostrils flared, working rapidly. He began to move around the small boat, no longer just observing. His movements were deliberate, focused. He walked to the starboard side, then to the port, his nose dipping close to the surface of the water, sampling. He let out a low growl, a soft, questioning sound. Suddenly, Ranger stopped dead at the bow. His ears flattened slightly, and his body tensed. He lowered his head, his nose almost touching the dark surface. A low, insistent whine vibrated in his chest. His tail gave a few rapid, short wags. Then he began to let out a series of short, sharp barks, all directed at a specific spot about 10 feet in front of the boat. He continued to bark, staring intently at the water, his whole body communicating an undeniable urgency. "What is it, Ranger?" Morgan asked, his voice hushed. He looked at the spot, but saw nothing. The surface of the water was unbroken, a perfect mirror of the sky. Andrew, however, was already leaning forward, his eyes narrowed. "Look close, Morgan," he whispered, "right where the dog's looking." Morgan strained his eyes. At first, he saw nothing. Then, almost imperceptibly, he noticed it. Tiny, iridescent slicks, barely visible, swirling on the water's surface, reflecting the sunlight in faint, oily rainbows. And then, bubbles. Small, persistent streams of tiny bubbles rising in a continuous, slow procession from the depths. They were so faint, so subtle, that a human eye would easily miss them against the shimmering light and the constant, shifting patterns of the water. But Ranger, with a sense of smell many thousands of times more powerful than a man's, had detected the faint trace of diesel fuel, of lubricants, of metal slowly corroding, all rising to the surface. "That's it," Morgan breathed, his blood quickening. "That's the boat." Morgan quickly geared up. He pulled on his wetsuit, a mask and flippers. Andrew handed him a heavy flashlight. "Be careful down there, son," Andrew warned, his voice grave. "Bayou currents can be tricky, and what's done in the dark stays in the dark sometimes." Morgan nodded, securing his mask. He knew Andrew was talking about more than just currents. He took a deep breath and, with a small splash, slipped into the dark, surprisingly warm water. The murky visibility was immediate. He could barely see a few feet in front of him. The weight of the water pressed in, and the sounds of the surface world faded, replaced by the distorted gurgle of his own breathing. He followed the stream of bubbles, descending slowly, deeper and deeper into the gloom. The flashlight beam cut a path through the sediment-laden water. Slowly, agonizingly, a shape began to emerge from the darkness. A large, dark mass. It was the boat. It lay on its side, partially buried in the soft, silty riverbed, its elegant lines now distorted and broken. The name Odyssey was barely visible on its stern. Morgan swam closer, his heart pounding. He began to examine the hull. It was indeed heavily damaged, but not in the way an accident would suggest. There was a large, jagged hole near the waterline on the port side. He ran his gloved hand over the edge. The metal was bent inward, as if struck from the outside by a powerful force. But then, as he moved further along the hull, he found what he was looking for. Just below the main cabin window, there were a series of smaller, cleaner punctures. They weren't jagged. They were almost perfectly round, and the metal around them was bent outward. Morgan knew this kind of damage. It was the work of a scuttling charge, a deliberate explosion designed to sink a vessel from the inside out. He found 2 such holes, precisely placed. There was no doubt this was no accident. This was an intentional act, carefully planned and executed. Someone wanted this boat to sink. Someone wanted Sterling to disappear. He ascended slowly, his lungs aching for air, his mind reeling with the confirmation. As he broke the surface, gasping, Andrew was there, helping him back into the boat. Ranger was whining softly, nudging his wet face. "Well?" Andrew asked, his voice tight with anticipation. Morgan pulled off his mask, water dripping from his face. "It wasn't an accident, Andrew," he said, his voice flat. "They sank it from the inside. Deliberate, premeditated." The words tasted like ash. The lie he had been forced to live with for so long was now staring him in the face, replicated in the dark waters of the bayou. Andrew's face, already etched with a lifetime of sorrow, now hardened with a grim resolve. He clenched his jaw, his gaze fixed on the murky water. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and simmering rage. Damn them all to hell. Sterling, he didn't deserve this. Morgan wrapped a towel around his shoulders, feeling the cold seep into his bones despite the sun. He looked at Andrew, then at Ranger. The fight had just escalated. They were no longer just seeking answers. They were holding proof of murder. And in Pelican's Rest, a place where truth was a luxury, that proof would make them very dangerous indeed. The discovery of the deliberately scuttled boat left a heavy pall over Morgan and Andrew. The grim reality settled in. Sterling hadn't just died. He had been murdered, and his death disguised as an accident. The implications were chilling. In Pelican's Rest, a tight-knit community where secrets were guarded fiercely, such a conspiracy could only thrive with the complicity, or at least the silence, of many. They spent the rest of the day in Andrew's small, cluttered living room, the charts of the bayou spread out on a worn wooden table. Ranger lay quietly at Morgan's feet, his presence a comforting warmth in the tense silence. Morgan meticulously cleaned his dive gear, the methodical movements, a way to channel his restless energy. Andrew, meanwhile, worked his phone, making calls to old acquaintances, people who had been on the river for generations. Each conversation was short, often ending with a frustrated sigh from Andrew. No one had seen anything. No one would talk. The wall of silence was impenetrable. "They're all scared, Morgan," Andrew finally said, running a hand through his gray hair. "Scared of losing their fishing rights, scared of losing their homes. This place, it looks wild, but it's fragile. People depend on the few folks with money, with power. And those folks, they don't like questions." Morgan knew the feeling. He remembered the blank stares, the averted eyes from the crew after Miller's accident, the fear of reprisal, the crushing weight of institutional authority. But here, it felt more personal, more suffocating. This wasn't a faceless military chain of command. It was a community, a family. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of deep orange and bruised purple, Morgan started to feel a prickle of unease. He had a sixth sense for trouble, a low hum of danger that had kept him alive in combat. It was humming now. "I need to get back to my place," he told Andrew. "I don't like leaving Ranger alone, and I just have a feeling." Andrew nodded, his expression grim. "Be careful, son. That feeling? In the bayou, it's usually right." Morgan and Ranger made their way back to his house in the gathering gloom. The bayou was alive with its nocturnal chorus, But to Morgan's ears, every splash, every rustle in the reeds sounded like a prelude to something darker. He secured the skiff, checked the locks on his doors and windows, and poured Ranger's dinner. The house felt exposed, vulnerable, despite its sturdy stilts. He was on the porch watching the last sliver of light disappear when it happened. The faint hum of an approaching outboard motor. It was distant at first, then grew steadily louder, cutting through the natural symphony of the night. Morgan froze, his hand instinctively going to the small, rusted axe he kept by the door for chopping kindling. Ranger, who had been lying quietly at his feet, instantly rose to a crouch, a low, menacing growl rumbling in his chest. His ears were flattened, his gaze fixed on the bend in the river that led to Morgan's dock. The hum intensified, becoming a roar as a boat rounded the bend. But unlike any other boat Morgan had seen on the bayou, this one was completely dark. No navigation lights, no running lights, just a phantom shape moving swiftly through the water. It was a larger, more powerful vessel than Andrew's skiff, or even Boudreaux's police boat. As it approached Morgan's dock, it didn't slow. It veered slightly, turning its bow directly towards the house. Then, a blinding beam of light erupted from the boat, a powerful spotlight cutting through the darkness like a laser. It swept across Morgan's porch, pinning him and Ranger in its harsh glare. The light was so intense it hurt his eyes, momentarily disorienting him. He shielded his face, Ranger whimpering softly at the sudden, aggressive intrusion. The boat lingered for what felt like an eternity, the powerful engine idling loudly, casting their silhouettes in stark relief against the dark house. The spotlight held them, a silent, menacing gaze. No one spoke. No one shouted a warning. It was a raw, visceral act of intimidation. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the spotlight clicked off, plunging them back into absolute darkness. The boat's engine roared to life, and it sped away, disappearing around the next bend as quickly as it had come, leaving nothing but a lingering hum and a churning wake. Morgan stood motionless long after the sound had faded. His heart was pounding, a cold sweat chilling his skin. That wasn't just a threat, it was a demonstration, a show of force. They knew. They knew he was digging, and they wanted him to know they were watching. Ranger, still tense, pressed against Morgan's leg, a reassuring presence in the oppressive silence. He spent the rest of the night on edge, unable to sleep, Ranger sleeping fitfully at the foot of his bed. The incident had shattered any remaining illusion of peace. The next morning, the air was still and hot. Morgan's first priority was to check his skiff. He walked down the dock, Ranger at his heels. The boat looked fine at first glance. No bullet holes, no obvious damage. He reached for the engine cover, his fingers brushing against something slick and sticky. He pulled his hand back, frowning. A dark, viscous liquid coated his fingertips. He smelled it. Kerosene. His eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a warning anymore. This was a clear act of sabotage. He carefully opened the engine cover and peered inside. The engine itself looked intact, but the fuel line had been tampered with. It was loose, leaking, and someone had poured something into the fuel tank. He dipped his finger into the gas tank and sniffed. It was undoubtedly tainted. The engine would either seize up entirely, or worse, explode, leaving him stranded, or worse, if he tried to start it. His last link to the outside world, his only quick means of transportation through the watery labyrinth of the bayou, was gone. They hadn't just threatened him, they had effectively cut him off. He was isolated, marooned on his stilt house. The message was loud and clear: stop digging, or drown. He looked at Ranger, whose keen eyes seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The dog let out a low growl, a rumble of shared frustration and defiance. Morgan felt a familiar fire ignite in his gut. They wanted him to quit. They wanted him to be scared. But fear, for Morgan, was always a precursor to a fight. And if they wanted to play rough, he would play rough too. This wasn't just about Sterling anymore. This was about self-preservation and justice for Miller. The past was now the present. He pulled out his phone. No signal. Of course. In Pelican's Rest, The lines of communication were as carefully controlled as the flow of the river itself. He was truly on his own. All he had was Andrew, his own wits, and a loyal German shepherd. It would have to be enough. The morning after the sabotage, the silence of the bayou felt like a cage. Morgan stood on his dock, staring at the useless engine of his skiff. The faint, acrid smell of kerosene still clung to the air, a stark reminder of his isolation. He was stranded, a prisoner in the very sanctuary he had chosen. His mind, trained to assess threats and formulate responses, cycled through his limited options. Staying put was a death sentence. It would only give them time to plan their next move. He had to act. He had to get to Andrew. His eyes fell upon the pirogue, a long, narrow canoe-like boat that had been left under the house by the previous owner. It was small, unstable, and meant for one person navigating calm waters, not for long-distance travel. But it was his only choice. "All right, Ranger," he said, his voice a low, determined murmur. "Looks like we're paddling." The journey was arduous. The small boat wobbled precariously with the combined weight of a large man and a German shepherd. Ranger, sensing the need for perfect stillness, lay down in the center of the pirogue, his body rigid, his amber eyes watching Morgan's every move. Morgan paddled with long, deep strokes, his muscles burning. Every ripple, every submerged log was a potential disaster. The hour-long trip felt like an eternity, a tense, grueling battle against the river and his own mounting frustration. By the time he reached Andrew's dock, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were raw. Andrew was waiting for him, his weathered face a mask of grim understanding. He had seen the sabotaged engine from a distance through his binoculars. "Knew you'd find a way," was all he said, helping Morgan tie up the unstable boat. Inside Andrew's kitchen, with a fresh pot of coffee brewing, they laid out the problem. "They've boxed us in," Morgan said, pacing the small room. "They know we found the boat, and they've cut us off. They control the main channels. We can't get to the police, and they can get to us whenever they want." He paused, looking at Andrew. "They must have a base of operations, a place to hide, to meet. It can't be in town. It has to be remote, but still accessible by water." Andrew nodded slowly, his gaze distant as he stared at the worn charts on his table. He traced the complex web of waterways with a gnarled finger. "There are hundreds of places like that. Old hunting camps, abandoned trappers' shacks." He fell silent, his eyes narrowing in concentration. He was digging deep into his memory, sifting through a lifetime of local knowledge, through stories passed down from his father and his grandfather. "There was a place," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "My daddy used to talk about it, called it the Conrach Bilang Quen, the Forgotten Bayou, a deep channel that cut through the cypress thicket. Said the gators there were as big as boats. It was a route the old-time smugglers used during Prohibition. But a hurricane back in, must have been 1985, it shifted the landscape, blocked the entrance with a decade's worth of fallen trees and silt. It's not on any modern chart. Everyone thinks the swamp swallowed it whole." Morgan stopped pacing. "Everyone thinks it's gone," he repeated, the strategic implications clicking into place, "which makes it the perfect place to hide." Andrew looked up, a flicker of something between fear and excitement in his old eyes. "It's a long shot, Morgan. If it's even still there, getting in would be hell. It's a wall of green." "We have to try," Morgan said. "It's the only move we have left." They set out in Andrew's boat, leaving the pirogue behind. Andrew guided them to the edge of the cypress thicket, a dense, forbidding section of the swamp that even most locals avoided. He cut the engine, and the boat drifted to a stop before what looked like an impenetrable wall of nature. Cypress knees, thick mangrove roots, and a curtain of heavy vines created a solid barrier. It looked exactly as Andrew had described, a dead end. "This is it," Andrew said, his voice laced with doubt. Or, "It was. Looks like I was right. The swamp won." They scanned the wall of green, looking for any sign of an opening, any gap large enough for the boat. There was nothing. Disappointment settled heavily in the air. But Ranger, who had been sitting patiently, now stood up. He moved to the bow, his body tense. He wasn't looking at the thicket as a whole. His head was cocked, his ears swiveling, and his nose was twitching furiously. He let out a soft whine, then took a step to the left, then back to the right, as if measuring something only he could perceive. Finally, he stopped, focusing his entire attention on a spot that looked no different from the rest of the barrier. He let out a single, sharp bark. "What's he got?" Andrew asked. Morgan moved to the bow, peering intently at the spot Ranger had indicated. He couldn't see an opening, but he did notice a subtle difference. The water right at that spot seemed to have a faint but definite current, a slight pull, suggesting a channel beyond. The hanging moss seemed thinner, and the branches were slightly less dense. It was almost invisible, a secret whispered by the river itself, and only Ranger had been able to hear it. "He's found it," Morgan said. "He's found the way in." Trusting the dog, they picked up their paddles and pushed the boat's nose into the spot Ranger had chosen. The entrance was so narrow that branches scraped along both sides of the hull. It was a claustrophobic, disorienting passage. They had to duck under thick, gnarled limbs and push aside heavy, hanging vines that felt like clammy arms. The air grew still and smelled of deep, ancient decay. Ranger acted as their guide, occasionally nudging the bow with his nose to indicate a subtle shift in the hidden channel, guiding them through the watery maze. After 20 minutes that felt like an hour, the oppressive tunnel of green suddenly gave way. The channel widened, and they emerged into a long, hidden waterway, flanked on both sides by towering ancient cypress trees. The water here was dark, still, and silent. It was like entering a lost world. They had found the forgotten bayou. Andrew cut the engine, and they began to paddle, their movements slow and silent, trying not to make a single sound that didn't belong. The tension was thick enough to taste. They were in enemy territory now. They rounded a slow bend in the channel. Suddenly, Ranger, standing vigilant at the bow, froze. He didn't bark or growl. He simply went rigid, the hair along his spine bristling. He emitted a low, soft huff of air, a sound so quiet Morgan almost missed it, and his gaze was locked on the riverbank to their right. Morgan instantly signaled for Andrew to stop paddling. He followed Ranger's intense stare, scanning the dense foliage. His eyes, trained to spot things that were out of place, swept the area. Then he saw it. A thin, dark line, almost invisible against the backdrop of leaves and shadows, stretched taut between two cypress knees just above the water level. A tripwire. Simple, but effective. It was likely connected to a noisemaker, a cluster of tin cans or a bell that would alert anyone nearby. Ranger's heightened senses, his ability to perceive the subtle threat that two experienced men had missed, had just saved them from revealing their presence. Morgan gave a series of silent hand signals to Andrew. Carefully, painstakingly, they maneuvered the boat to the far side of the channel, giving the trap a wide berth. They were close. They were. The camp had to be just ahead. They moved forward, gliding like a ghost through the black water, their hearts pounding in unison, ready for whatever lay waiting for them in the heart of the swamp's deepest secret. Beyond the tripwire, the forgotten bayou opened up slightly. The water widened into a small, stagnant pool, and beyond that, nestled amidst a cluster of ancient cypress and willow trees, was the camp. It wasn't a sprawling complex, but a collection of 3 rustic cabins, built on slightly higher ground, connected by rough wooden walkways. A small, rickety dock jutted into the murky water, where 2 powerful modern airboats were moored, their propellers gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney of the largest cabin, betraying recent activity. Morgan and Andrew pulled their boat into a thick patch of reeds and camouflaged it as best they could. Ranger lay low in the boat, his eyes fixed on the camp, his body a coiled spring. The air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke, old canvas, and something else, something faintly metallic, like a generator. "Looks like they're home," Andrew whispered, his voice tight. "Or were, recently." They spent the next hour in agonizingly slow observation. Morgan, using a small pair of binoculars Andrew had brought, meticulously scanned the camp. He saw clothes drying on a line, a half-eaten plate of food on a table outside one cabin, but no one moved. The silence was unnerving. It was too quiet. Then, just as the sun began its slow descent, a figure emerged from the largest cabin. Morgan's breath hitched. It was Richard Sterling, the very man who had been officially declared dead weeks ago. He was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed beard and a stern, weathered face. He looked gaunt, a shadow of the vibrant man Andrew had described, but unmistakably alive. He walked slowly to the edge of the porch, lit a cigarette, and gazed out at the still water, a posture of bored waiting. "It's him," Andrew breathed, a mix of relief and fury in his voice. "The bastard's alive." After a few minutes, Sterling tossed his cigarette butt into the water and went back inside. 10 minutes later, 2 men emerged from one of the other cabins. They were younger, tougher-looking, dressed in casual work clothes. They climbed into one of the airboats and, with a roar that shattered the bayou's stillness, sped off down the channel, presumably on a patrol or a supply run. Sterling reappeared on the porch of the main cabin and stood there for a moment, watching them go, before retreating back inside. "This is our chance," Morgan whispered. "They're either alone or with minimal security. We go in." Andrew nodded, his jaw set. Ranger, sensing their heightened tension, gave a soft whine, then looked at Morgan, ready for his command. "Stay low, Ranger," Morgan murmured, stroking the dog's head. "Guard the boat. If anything comes back, you let us know. Understand?" Ranger licked his hand, a silent affirmation. They moved like ghosts through the dense foliage, Morgan leading the way, Andrew following close behind. They circled the camp, approaching the largest cabin where Sterling had been. Morgan used his Navy training, moving silently from cover to cover, assessing every shadow, every rustle. The windows of the cabin were small and grimy, but through a cracked pane, Morgan could see Sterling at a table, sorting through a stack of papers. They waited until darkness fully enveloped the camp, using the deepening shadows as their cloak. With Andrew covering him, Morgan silently approached the back door. It was old, wooden, and secured with a simple padlock. A quick expert tug with a pry bar, and the lock snapped, the sound barely a whisper in the night. They slipped inside. The main cabin was sparsely furnished, smelling of stale cigarette smoke and mildew. In the flickering light of a single lantern on the table, Sterling was indeed poring over papers. Andrew pointed to a small, heavy safe tucked into a corner. "That's where Sterling would keep anything important," he whispered. Morgan signaled for Andrew to keep watch while he approached Sterling. The man looked up, his eyes widening in shock as he saw Morgan, a ghost emerging from the shadows. Before Sterling could react, Morgan grabbed him, twisting his arm behind his back and pressing him against the wall. "Sterling?" Morgan's voice was a low growl. "Richard Sterling, you're supposed to be dead." Sterling struggled, trying to shout, but Morgan clamped a hand over his mouth. "We know about the boat. We know it was no accident." Andrew, meanwhile, had moved to the table. He quickly sifted through the papers Sterling had been examining. They were insurance policies, bank statements, and oddly, a ledger filled with coded entries. He spotted a stack of photographs, men he knew, men who had been declared dead in similar accidents over the past few years, now looking very much alive and well. "This is it, Morgan," Andrew exclaimed, grabbing his phone. "The proof." He began taking pictures of the documents, the ledger, the photos of the dead men. Sterling, his eyes wide with terror, managed to muffle a word, something that sounded like Dubois. Suddenly, there was a muffled thud from outside. Then another, closer. It sounded like something large had hit the wooden walkway. Morgan's head snapped up. "Ranger," he whispered, his heart pounding. The sound wasn't a bark, not a growl. It was a dull, heavy impact. "We've been made," Andrew said, his voice grim, finishing the last photo. "They're back." Just as Andrew said it, A voice from outside boomed, "Hey, who's in there?" Footsteps thudded heavily on the wooden walkway leading to the cabin. Morgan shoved Sterling away from the wall. "Andrew, go! Get to the boat!" Andrew nodded, tucking his phone into a waterproof pouch. He turned to dash out the back door they had entered. Just as he reached the threshold, a loud metallic clang echoed through the night. Something large and cylindrical rolled from a shelf above the door, dislodged by the rapid movement. It struck a stack of empty metal buckets that had been piled precariously near the door. The sound, amplified in the still night, was like a thunderclap. The shouting from outside intensified. "They're in the main cabin! Get 'em!" Morgan knew they were cornered. He grabbed Sterling, dragging him towards the back door. "Move!" he barked. Andrew was already halfway down the walkway, scrambling to get to their boat. As Morgan and Sterling burst out of the cabin, the two airboats that had left earlier were now back, pulling up to the main dock. Two men, wielding shotguns, were already leaping out. Another figure, shorter and stockier, remained on one of the boats, shouting orders. It was the man Morgan recognized as Deputy Boudreau. "Get 'em!" Boudreau's voice boomed across the water. "Don't let them get to their boat!" Morgan pushed Sterling ahead of him, covering their retreat. Shots rang out, splinters flying from the wooden railings near their heads. He heard Andrew frantically trying to push their camouflaged boat free from the reeds. Ranger, still in the boat, was barking wildly now, a furious, desperate sound. The element of surprise was gone. They were exposed, trapped, and the hunt had begun. The escape from the camp was a chaotic, desperate flight through the labyrinth of the bayou. Andrew's small boat, pushed to its absolute limit, skimmed across the dark water, the roar of its small engine a frantic cry against the night's oppressive silence. Behind them, the deeper, more powerful growl of the airboats was a constant, terrifying promise of pursuit. Ranger stood braced at the bow, a dark silhouette against the moonlit water, his barks sharp and furious, a lone sentinel covering their retreat. Shotgun blasts echoed through the cypress trees, the pellets peppering the water around them, sending up small, violent splashes. "They're gaining on us!" Andrew yelled over the engine's scream, his knuckles white as he gripped the tiller. Morgan's mind was a whirlwind of tactical calculations. They couldn't outrun them, not with this much horsepower against them. Their only advantage was knowledge and maneuverability. "To the left, Andrew," he commanded, pointing to a narrow, almost invisible channel choked with low-hanging branches. "They're too wide to follow us through there." Andrew, without hesitation, spun the tiller, and the small boat veered sharply into the tight passage. Branches whipped at their faces, and the bottom of the boat scraped against a submerged log, but they were through. Behind them, they heard the frustrated roar of the airboats as their pursuers were forced to slow down and find another route. It was a temporary reprieve, a few precious minutes, bought with a high-risk maneuver. Their destination was the only logical one they had: Morgan's Stilt house. It wasn't a fortress, but it was defensible ground. It was home. They reached the dock moments ahead of their pursuers, the powerful hum of the airboats already audible again in the distance. "Get inside. Now," Morgan ordered, helping the older man scramble onto the dock. Ranger leaped from the boat, instantly taking up a defensive position at the top of the stairs, a low growl rumbling in his chest. As Andrew fumbled with the key, Morgan worked, his movements swift and economical. He untied his sabotaged skiff and gave it a hard shove, sending it drifting out into the channel, a potential obstacle. He grabbed the heavy wooden bench from the porch and wedged it under the door handle. Once inside, the soldier in him took complete control. The quiet, haunted veteran was gone, replaced by a man operating on pure training and instinct. "Andrew, push that table against the door," he commanded. Together, they shoved the heavy oak table, barricading their only entrance. "The windows!" He moved quickly through the small house, slamming shut the wooden storm shutters, plunging the room into near-total darkness, leaving only thin slits for observation. The house was no longer a home. It was a bunker. He gathered their meager arsenal, the kindling axe, a heavy cast-iron skillet from the kitchen, and Andrew's long, sharp fishing gaff. He handed the skillet to Andrew. "Stay in that corner, away from the windows. If anyone gets through, you swing for their head. Understood?" Andrew, pale and breathing heavily, but with a look of grim determination, nodded. Understood. Just as they finished, the airboats arrived, circling the house like predators. Their powerful spotlights crisscrossed the building, probing for weaknesses. Voices, rough and angry, echoed across the water. "Nowhere to run, city boy. Come on out, and maybe we'll make it quick." Morgan ignored them. He peered through a crack in the shutters, watching as two men armed with shotguns prepared to storm the dock. His entire world narrowed to that single point of entry. The first man leaped onto the dock, then the second. They started up the stairs. Morgan waited, his grip tightening on the handle of the axe. In the tense silence, broken only by the lapping of the water and the idling of the engines, Morgan felt the old tremors start in his hands. The smell of the damp, enclosed space, the adrenaline, the imminent violence, it was all pulling him back to the nightmare. He could feel the cold sweat on his brow, the frantic pounding of his heart threatening to overwhelm his training. He was losing his grip. He chanced to glance down. Ranger was lying flat on the floor, his body low and tense, but his breathing was steady and deep. He wasn't panicked. He was coiled, focused, and ready. The dog must have felt Morgan's gaze because he lifted his head and their eyes met in the gloom. In Ranger's steady, unwavering gaze, Morgan saw not fear, but absolute trust and a calm, powerful resolve. It was an anchor, a lifeline. Morgan took a deep, shuddering breath, and the shaking in his hands stopped. He was not on that ship. He was here, in this house with his friends. He was in control. Ranger's quiet strength had pulled him back from the edge. The first attacker reached the top of the stairs and charged the door. The wood shuddered under the impact of his shoulder. Morgan braced himself. As the second man joined the assault, the old door began to splinter, but their focus on the front was a classic tactical error. While two men were creating a diversion at the door, a third, younger and more agile henchman had silently slipped into the water on the far side of the house. Using the thick wooden pilings as handholds, he climbed with a stealthy reptilian grace, hoisting himself onto the screened-in back porch. The sound of shattering wood and tearing screen was explosive in the small house. The henchman was in. He saw Andrew, the older, more vulnerable target, and lunged for him, grabbing the old man from behind and pinning his arms. "Got one!" the man yelled triumphantly to his partners outside. Morgan whirled around, the axe in his hand, but he was across the room, blocked by furniture. He was too far away. A cold dread seized him as he saw the henchman pull a long knife. He wouldn't make it in time, but the attacker had made a fatal miscalculation. He had forgotten about the dog. From the deep shadows under the main table, where Morgan had placed him, a sable missile exploded into the room. There was no warning bark, no furious growl. It was a silent, lethal launch. Ranger, a blur of muscle and fur, slammed into the henchman with the force of a battering ram. The attacker was knocked off his feet, the knife clattering across the wooden floor. Before he could even register what had happened, Ranger was on him. The dog's powerful jaws clamped down on the man's shoulder, not tearing, but holding with immense, crushing pressure. His training was to neutralize the threat, not to kill. Pinned to the floor, the henchman let out a strangled scream of pain and terror as a deep, terrifying growl finally erupted from Ranger's chest. The scream shocked the attackers outside into a moment of confused silence. The assault on the front door stopped. Morgan seized the opportunity, crossing the room in 2 long strides. He kicked the knife away and drove the butt end of the axe handle hard into the downed man's temple, knocking him unconscious. The immediate threat was over. They had a hostage. A brief, precious respite. Morgan stood breathing heavily in the dark, fortified room, Andrew leaning against the wall, shaken but unharmed. Outside, the boats continued to circle, their lights sweeping the water, their occupants now wary and uncertain. The long night was far from over, but thanks to Ranger, they had survived the first wave. The standoff in the darkened Stilt house was a fragile, terrifying truce. Outside, the two airboats idled, their powerful engines a constant, menacing hum in the night. Inside, the captured henchman lay bound and gagged on the floor, while Andrew kept a nervous watch, his knuckles white around the handle of the cast-iron skillet. The immediate assault had been repelled, but Morgan knew they were living on borrowed time. Their attackers were patient predators, content to wait them out, to let exhaustion and fear do their work. "They're not leaving," Andrew whispered, peering through a crack in the shutters. "They've got us pinned." "Then we can't stay," Morgan replied, his mind racing through tactical scenarios. The house was a trap. Their only hope was to get the evidence, the photos on Andrew's phone, to the authorities. "Andrew, the next town over, across the lake. Is there a state police barracks there?" Andrew nodded. "Yeah, a small one. But that's a 20-mile run across open water. They'll see us the second we leave the dock. We'd never make it." "We might," Morgan said, a desperate, high-risk plan forming in his mind. "If we can fix my skiff, if we can move before they expect it." The idea was madness. To attempt a delicate engine repair in the dead of night, with armed men waiting just yards away. But it was the only plan they had. While Andrew kept the hostage covered, occasionally shouting threats to the boats outside to maintain the illusion of a stalemate, Morgan slipped out the back of the house. He moved with a deathly silence, lowering himself into the cool, dark water beneath the house, the sounds of his own breathing loud in his ears. He made his way to the dock, his body shielded by the pilings. Working by the faint, shielded glow of a small waterproof flashlight held between his teeth, he began his assessment of the sabotaged engine. The kerosene in the fuel tank was the main problem. He couldn't drain it without making noise. The only solution was a bypass. He found a spare 5-gallon jerry can of clean gasoline he kept for emergencies and, using a length of spare tubing from Andrew's boat, began to rig a direct, gravity-fed fuel line to the carburetor. It was a crude, temporary fix, a trick he'd learned in the field to get a damaged vehicle moving just long enough to escape a hot zone. Every clink of a tool, every quiet curse, felt like a gunshot in the silent night. He worked for hours, his fingers growing numb, his body chilled by the water. Ranger remained inside with Andrew, a silent, watchful guardian. Occasionally, a low growl would emanate from the house, a signal that the enemy boats were moving, probing, testing their defenses. Each time, Morgan would freeze, his heart hammering against his ribs, until the growl subsided. Just as the first hint of gray began to soften the eastern sky, he finished. The makeshift fuel line was in place. It was ugly and it was dangerous, but it might just work. He slipped back into the house, his clothes dripping, a silent signal to Andrew that it was time. Their breakout was an act of calculated chaos. Morgan cut the hostages' bonds. "Tell them we're coming out," he hissed. "Tell them you're coming first." The terrified henchman stumbled onto the porch, shouting to his comrades. As the spotlights from the airboats swiveled to focus on him, Morgan, Andrew, and Ranger burst from the house, a tight, fast-moving unit. They scrambled down the stairs and into the skiff. At the last possible second, Morgan gave the hostage a hard shove, sending him sprawling onto the dock towards his allies. "Go!" he yelled at Andrew. Andrew, already in the driver's seat, turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, then roared to life. He slammed the throttle, and the skiff shot away from the dock, leaving the stunned attackers behind. For a glorious, heart-stopping moment, it seemed like they had made it. But the powerful engines of the airboats roared in response, and the chase was on. This was no longer a game of cat and mouse in the narrow channels. This was a raw, brutal race across the wide, open water of the lake. The airboat was faster, its massive propeller chewing through the water, gaining on them with terrifying speed. Bullets skipped across the surface behind them. Morgan crouched low, shielding Andrew with his own body, the axe clutched in his hand. The airboat didn't try to disable them. Its driver was skilled, pulling alongside their smaller skiff, the two boats scraping and shuddering against each other in the choppy water. The intention was clear. They were going to board. A burly henchman, his face a mask of rage, stood on the edge of the airboat, balancing himself against the motion. In his hands, he held a long, heavy boat hook with a wickedly sharp point. He was less than 3 feet away, close enough for Morgan to see the cold fury in his eyes. He raised the hook high, preparing to swing it down on Andrew. Time seemed to slow. Morgan was too low, too off balance to stop him. Andrew was trapped behind the wheel. It was over. But in that split second of imminent violence, another force intervened. Ranger, who had been braced between the seats, saw the raised weapon, saw the direct threat to his family. With a guttural roar that was pure protective fury, he acted. He didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a command. He launched himself across the narrow gap between the two speeding boats. It was a leap of pure instinct and loyalty. His powerful body slammed into the henchman with incredible force, his jaws closing on the man's arm. The attacker screamed, a sound of shock and agony, as he was thrown off balance. The boat hook flew from his grasp, clattering uselessly to the floor of the airboat. The sudden chaos on the enemy boat was immediate. The driver flinched, instinctively pulling back on his controls. The henchman's partner scrambled to help, trying to beat the dog off. In the ensuing struggle, the second man grabbed a heavy wooden oar and swung it wildly. It connected with Ranger's side with a sickening, wet thud. Ranger let out a sharp, piercing yelp of pain, his grip faltering for just a second. But his sacrifice had bought them the only thing that mattered: time. The momentary distraction was all Morgan needed. He shoved Andrew's shoulder. "Turn! Hard!" Andrew spun the wheel, and Morgan slammed the throttle forward. The skiff veered sharply away from the airboat, the makeshift fuel line holding under the strain. They shot forward, gaining a precious few yards, while the men on the airboat were still in disarray, trying to fend off a wounded, furious dog and tend to their injured crewmate. They had broken free. The airboat fell back, its occupants shouting in rage, but their organized assault was shattered. Morgan didn't look back. The roar of victory he should have felt was choked by a wave of cold, sickening fear. He cut the throttle slightly, and the sound that filled the air was one that broke his heart, the high, thin sound of Ranger, whimpering in pain. He turned to see Andrew already on the floor of the boat, cradling the dog's head. There was a dark, wet patch of fur on Ranger's side, and his breathing was shallow and ragged. The hope of rescue, now a tangible shoreline growing larger in the distance, was poisoned by the terrible, urgent fear for the life of his best friend. They had won their freedom, but the cost was devastatingly high. The skiff slammed against the public dock of St. Martinville with a jarring thud. The world outside of their desperate flight was shockingly normal. People were loading fishing gear, children were laughing, and the morning sun glinted off the calm, wide waters of the lake. For Morgan and Andrew, it was like surfacing from a deep, dark dive into a world that had kept on turning without them. But their reality was the whimpering, broken animal lying on the floor of the boat. "We need a vet! Now!" Morgan's voice was raw, ragged with fear and exhaustion. A man casting a net from the dock, seeing the blood-matted fur on Ranger's side and the wild look in Morgan's eyes, pointed a trembling finger. Down the street, 2 blocks, Doc Albury's place, best vet in the parish. They didn't waste a second. Morgan gently lifted Ranger into his arms, the dog's weight a terrible, limp burden. Andrew, his old joints aching, scrambled after him, clutching the waterproof pouch containing their evidence like a holy relic. They half ran, half stumbled through the small town, ignoring the stares of onlookers. The veterinarian, a woman named Dr. Albury, with kind, capable eyes and a calm demeanor that was a balm on Morgan's frayed nerves, took one look at Ranger and immediately cleared an examination table. "What happened to him?" she asked, her hands already expertly and gently probing the dog's injured side. "He was struck with an oar," Morgan managed to say, the words catching in his throat. "He has at least 2 broken ribs, and I'm worried about internal bleeding," she said after a tense moment. "I need to take him for x-rays and get him on fluids immediately. You'll have to wait outside." Leaving Ranger on that cold metal table was one of the hardest things Morgan had ever done. As the door to the operating room swung shut, he was left in the sterile, quiet waiting room, the silence roaring in his ears. The fight was over, but his anchor was gone, and he felt terrifyingly adrift. Andrew placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "He's a fighter, Morgan, just like you. Now, we have to do our part." With a heavy heart, they walked to the state police barracks. They were a sorry sight, mud-stained, exhausted, and running on pure adrenaline. The officer at the front desk looked at them with deep suspicion, but Andrew, with the unshakable gravity of an old man who has seen too much, laid his phone on the counter. "My name is Andrew Hebert," he said, his Cajun accent thick but his voice clear. "This is Morgan, and we have evidence of multiple murders, insurance fraud, and corruption involving Deputy Sheriff Boudreau of Pelican's Rest." The statement was so blunt, so audacious, that it commanded attention. A senior detective was called, and they were led into a small, sterile interrogation room. For the next hour, they laid out the entire story, from the cut life vest to the scuttled boat to the hidden camp. The detective listened, his expression shifting from skepticism to shock to grim belief as Andrew swiped through the damning photos. The ledger, the fake documents, the faces of men officially declared dead. The evidence was irrefutable. When Morgan described the role of Deputy Boudreau, the detective picked up his phone and made a call, his voice low and urgent. The case was immediately escalated. Within the hour, the FBI was involved. The raid was swift and overwhelming. A fleet of state police and FBI tactical boats descended on the quiet waters of Pelican's Rest, a wave of justice washing over the corrupt backwater. The henchmen at the camp, caught completely by surprise, surrendered without a fight. Deputy Boudreau was arrested in his office, his face a mask of disbelief. The final piece of the puzzle was apprehended in the town's clean, quiet medical clinic. Dr. Dubois, a man in his late 60s with gentle eyes, silver hair, and a respectable tweed jacket, was in the middle of examining a child's sore throat when the officers entered. He showed no surprise, no anger, only a kind of weary resignation, as if he had been expecting this day for a long time. As they led him out in handcuffs, he saw Morgan standing by one of the police cruisers. Their eyes met. Dubois stopped, and for a moment he didn't look like a criminal mastermind, but like a disappointed father. "You're the new fella, aren't you?" Dubois said, his voice soft and cultured, entirely devoid of malice. "The Navy man?" Morgan just stared, his mind struggling to reconcile this calm, grandfatherly figure with the man who had ordered others to their deaths. "You see a crime, son," Dubois continued, a strange sadness in his eyes. "I see 100 families who are being choked to death by debt, by banks from cities that don't give a damn about people like us. I gave them a baptism, a way to be reborn, free from a life that was already a prison. I saved them." He shook his head slowly. "You just don't like my methods." The words hit Morgan with an unexpected force. The victory suddenly felt complicated, the lines between good and evil blurred by a motive that was, in its own twisted way, born of a desire to protect his community. This wasn't a simple monster. He was a man with a savior complex so profound that he saw murder as an act of mercy. It didn't excuse his actions, but it made the triumph feel hollow, tinged with the tragedy of a man who had become the very thing he sought to fight. 3 months later. The autumn sun cast a warm, golden light across the bayou. The oppressive humidity of summer had given way to a crisp, pleasant breeze that rustled the changing leaves of the cypress trees. On the porch of the Stilt house, Ranger lay basking in the sun. He was thinner, and a long, faint scar ran along his side, a permanent reminder of his bravery, but his tail thumped a steady rhythm against the wooden planks. He was healed. A ball arced through the air and landed near the dock. Ranger was on his feet in an instant, chasing it with the joyous, bounding energy of a dog reborn. Morgan watched him, a genuine smile gracing his features. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, settled calm. He had faced the ghosts of his past by fighting the demons of the present, and in doing so, he had found a measure of peace he never thought possible. The sound of a familiar boat motor approached, and Andrew pulled up to the dock in a new, sturdy vessel. Painted on its side in clean, bold letters were the words, "Pelican's Rest Volunteer River Patrol." "Ready to make the rounds?" Andrew called out, his voice cheerful. "Always," Morgan replied. Ranger leaped into the boat, taking his customary position at the bow. Morgan and Andrew followed, and they set out onto the water. They were no longer running or hiding. They were guardians. Their days were spent helping stranded boaters, monitoring the water for poachers, and simply being a reassuring presence on the river. They had taken the trauma and violence that had invaded their lives and transformed it into a new, shared purpose. As they headed down the channel, the water sparkling in the afternoon light, Morgan looked at Andrew, his friend, and at Ranger, his savior. He had come to the bayou seeking solitude, but had found a family. He had come seeking quiet, but had found his voice. The river was no longer a place of dark secrets and silent threats. It was home, and for the first time in a very long time, home felt safe. True loyalty is not just about standing beside someone. It is about being the anchor that holds them steady through the storm, the quiet presence that guides them back to the light when all seems lost. If this story of the unbreakable bond between a veteran and his faithful partner touched your heart, you help us share more tales just like it. Every subscription is a message that these stories of courage and healing matter, and every comment or share helps our community grow. The journey doesn't have to end here, as another story is waiting for you right now, right on your screen.